Hey, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk, and thanks for coming out today in general. This is a really cool day. A lot of interesting research being presented. So the stuff I'm going to talk about today is a microdosing study that my colleagues and I ran on a community sample of online microdosing. So yeah, I'll introduce you to some of our definitions and how we went through it. So the way the talk outline is first I'm going to be talking about our working definition of what microdosing is, and then I'll discuss a little bit the sample recruitment, how that went, how we got people to join, and their characteristics. And then I'll go into the data. So I split the data, very broadly speaking, into two categories: qualitative findings and quantitative findings. The qualitative findings will be discussed using something called grounded theory, and the quantitative stuff is all pre-registered. I'll talk more about pre-registration in a few minutes. After I present all the findings, I'll talk about our future directions, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I don't know if you can see it. This turned out to be kind of small, but there are slide numbers at the bottom. So if you have questions, ideally make a note of which slide you have a question about so that we can go back to that at the end. Yeah, so let's start with a little bit we can't talk about microdosing without talking about full dose psychedelics. I'm assuming everyone knows that it's kind of great, kind of promising. There's a lot of really great research about full dose psychedelics. And just one example of a paper published in 2017 by Cart, Harris et al. They looked at people with depression, and the way they measured depression is using the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomology, or QIDS. So at baseline, people were definitely clinically depressed, past the threshold of being clinically depressed. And just 1 week after a full dose of psilocybin, people were no longer clinically depressed on average. And that effect was maintained even after 3 months. That's huge. That's very, very promising. That's very cool. But this is a life-changing experiencing, literally, right? Going through a psychedelic trip could change your life, could rock things to the core. And it's not always right, and it's not for everyone necessarily. You could have people where their psyche is somewhat fractured, or people who just don't feel like they're stable enough where they are in life to really go into this kind of life-changing experience. This could break some people, and indeed, a lot of people, even in the clinical research, a lot of people describe their psychedelic experiences as difficult or challenging. I don't know if people here have experienced that kind of thing. It's pretty common, right? And a lot of the time from these challenging experiences, we grow the most, but some people just aren't ready for that quite yet. And I was also thinking that another really important context where full dose may be a hindrance is in the context of psychotherapy. So for some people, it could be great. They could really open up and really rethink their behavior or their core constructs. But for other people, it may mean that they can't really engage with the psychotherapy. And for this kind of context, and I'm thinking many others perhaps, microdosing could be really useful. So I'm not going to go very much into what microdosing has been, what's been going on in the media. It's been very, very popular, but I'm trying to make more of a science-y talk here. I won't talk much about the media. Everyone has access to the media. What I want to show you is our research. So the working definition we used, and I say working definition because there's no real rigorous definition. We kind of don't really know what a microdose is, except for how it's supposed to be subperceptual. So we went with that. What's subperceptual? Subperceptual means it's not a light trip. It's not a small trip. It's like you don't even know that it's there, but it's doing something behind the scenes. But in terms of dosage, it's not really clear. There may be individual differences based on genetics or psychology or metabolism. We don't know. I can tell you that for the specific substances we were interested in, which are LSD and psilocybin, we used our working definition for a microdose for these two substances was about 10% of a full dose. So for LSD, it's between 10 and 20 micrograms, or 10% of a tab. And for magic mushrooms, it's between 0.2 and 0.3 grams. So that's kind of what we went with. When people reported more than that, we consider them to not be microdosing. So they were not included in the final analysis. And indeed, there's been a lot of media attention, right? And I'm sure that all of you have heard some anecdotes about what microdosing has done, or maybe you've experienced it yourself. So we also asked people in our online survey, we asked people to report some anecdotes, like what have they experienced through microdosing. And so I'm just going to present 3 of these. We had many. I'm just going to present 3 that I picked kind of at random. So one is, when I microdose, I seem to be able to understand things the first time I read them much more often. That's pretty cool. That's neat. Another person said when their psilocybin experiment helped them get relief from depression and alcoholism. That's amazing. That's really impressive. Another person said something that was just kind of surprising to me. It helped with their migraines. These are all great. These are very promising. But this is not science. These are anecdotes, right? And so when we do science, we want to pool together a lot of data, and we want to try and make sense of it, and we want to see if it's replicable. And so that's what we did. And I'll walk you through how we ran the study a little bit, and then jump right into the results. So before we even started, we pre-registered our study, and we used something called Open Science. I'm not going to talk about this very much. This is particularly relevant for those of you who are thinking of getting into science or are currently doing scientific work. But it means that before we started, we pre-registered our hypotheses. We said what we were going to do. And that becomes time-stamped. And then once we finish doing our research and we want to publish our paper, we show the publication, look, this is what we planned to do, and this is what we actually did, and look that it matches. We're not hiding things, and we didn't do anything we weren't planning on doing. It's really, really important if you want to have science that's replicable. I'm super happy to talk more about this. If people are interested, please come see me after. I can talk about this all day, so please do. Another important point is that we believe in open materials. So right now you can go into the website. I'll give you the website at the end of the talk. You can see everything we did. You can see our survey, all the questions. You can see our ethics application. So if you want to do this kind of work in the future, you can use our materials and tweak them however you see fit, and that'll make your life so much easier. And that's, again, we believe this to be a big, important part of the scientific endeavor. We're here to work together, all right? And finally, once we've published our papers, and that's currently in the works, we will also post all of our data online. So anyone could see it. It'll be anonymous, but you could see everything we found, and you could run your own analyses, and that's super great. Sorry, I went on too long. I get too excited about this stuff. So in terms of our recruitment, the way we went is basically on social media. We used Twitter, we used Facebook, we used Reddit, we used a bunch of subreddits like r/microdosing, r/DMT, r/sample size. And we basically wanted to see what people on Reddit or elsewhere on social media can tell us about microdosing. And I don't know if people know about Reddit, but that's how I think that had a little bit of an impact on our sample composition. So let's talk a little bit about what our sample was like. We had 1,390 participants, and that's great. That's a really good number. But as you can see, sample was pretty limited. White, male, heterosexual. Saying about how the sample was heterogeneous. And this, on one hand, yes, this limits how much we can infer from the sample to the general population. At the same time, this sample, these are the people who go on social media microdose and are then happy to talk about their microdosing experience. So these are the people that these results can speak to. That being said, it's limited, and when we do future research, we'll try and avoid these kind of biases in our sample. Next up, in terms of our sample's microdosing status. So broadly speaking, we had 66% microdosers and 34% non-microdosers. But we didn't just ask, do you microdose or do you not microdose? We created kind of like a quasi-timeline between people who are not interested in microdosing and have never done it. And then there's people who have not done it yet but are interested in it. And then you have people that are currently not microdosing but have done it in the past. And finally, people who are currently doing it. And the reason we wanted to do that is so that we can distinguish between not just microdosers and non-microdosers, but also between people who want to do it and people who are currently doing it. So it's not quite an experimental way of demarcating these differences, but it's one way of saying the difference, if we find a difference between this group and this group, it's not because of their will to microdose, it's because they actually microdosed. In terms of the substances they used, LSD was by far the most popular substance, and psilocybin was the next. And out of the 15% others, DMT was reasonably popular, but it wasn't something we were particularly interested in. It's in the data, so once that becomes public, people can totally look into that. I think it's important to note that out of the 15% other, 34% were other lysergamide, so stuff like 1P-LSD. And psilocybin was also quite popular, and that's a molecule that's related to psilocybin. We also asked people about how often they microdose. And what we found is that there are these two main bumps here. One bump, I don't know if you can see, this one says microdose 1 day on, 2 days off. So these are people that microdose quite often, and we think that we also, I don't know if people here have heard about the work of Jim Fadiman and Sophia Korb. So I think that this is related to their sample because that's kind of what they told people to do. But I think also in the context of the other bump, I think it teaches us something. The other bump, the smaller one, is people who microdose once a week. And what I infer from that is that you have people that do it often, almost medicinally, and they really get something out of it, and they do it frequently. And you have people who do it occasionally, maybe when they need a little bump in mood or creativity or just, I don't know, to party or something. But there are definitely two modes of microdosing. So I think that's interesting, and I think that future research could really benefit from looking more at that. So next up, our qualitative findings. I'm going to walk you through this thing called grounded theory. And this is the way in which it's a really basic way of making sense when you get a lot of responses from a lot of people and try and find common themes and then transform those common themes into potentially hypotheses that you can study. And so the way you do it is like so. First you have people, and then you have them say what they think about various things. I'll be more specific in a minute. I'm just trying to introduce the broad concept. And then you look at what they said and you try and find themes. And then out of these things, you build basic notions, and then you put those into superordinate categories. And then you try and find one large superordinate category that kind of can accommodate for all of them. Once you do that, you can present this data in different ways. We went with a graphic way so that we can make sense of it. And yeah, let me show you exactly what I mean by this. So this is a part of our survey. This is what it looked like. And here we asked, tell us about the three main benefits that you've experienced from microdosing, right? So we asked that, and we have people say how important that is to them. And then we do the same thing for drawbacks, right? Because yeah, psychedelics are great, but maybe they have drawbacks, and maybe it's important to talk about that. So we were curious to see what people would report. And then we get giant lists. Imagine you have 1,390 participants, each of them giving 3 of each. I'm not going to do the math. It's a big number. And then you have lists. This is one example of a list. So there's focus, antidepressant effects, antidepressant, mood lift, awareness, happiness, focus, helps depression, antidepressant. Common theme here is antidepressant. And so we put that into the reduced depression bin. Another example is, and this one was really easy, creativity. A lot of people reported creativity, and they reported it pretty straightforwardly, so that goes into the creativity bin. One last example, and the one that was probably the hardest to categorize, people are saying worth the experiment, or interesting experience, or excitement, or fun, or bragging rights. It was kind of hard to put in one bin, so we went with novelty. People were doing it because it's cool, and they were interested and curious. And then once we have that, once we've looked into the data and found common themes, the next thing to do is put it in specific categories. So this is just one example of things that are kind of related, but we thought that improved focus, heightened awareness, mindful presence, and engagement are all kind of in the same category. And improved energy, alertness, wakefulness, and stimulation is in another category. So the superordinate categories here are improved focus and attention and improved energy. And if you want to put all of that in one bin, it would be improved focus and energy. And from that, we can move on to graph it and see what people actually reported, how much of what was going on. So let's look at this and talk for a minute. The 3 main benefits people reported were improved mood and improved focus, and then creativity. All right, I think these make sense. This is kind of what's been hyped in the media, and I think it makes sense and it looks great. I think it was maybe equally as interesting to look at the drawbacks. And so by far, the most common drawback was illegality. That's not a drawback of the substance. That's a drawback of public policy, of many other things that are not the substance per se. And that included stuff like people being worried that they're going to get caught, people worrying that they can't find their dosage because it's an illegal substance. So every time they get a new batch, they don't exactly know how strong it is, stuff like that. So even though a lot of people report that and it's a valid finding, I don't think that it is super important for the future of psychedelics research, except for how we can show this to policymakers and say, look, the main thing that people are complaining about is that it's illegal. But there's also other things. People are reporting physiological discomfort. So that includes stuff like muscle aches, GI discomfort, trouble sleeping. So this, yeah.
Would that mean 1 out of 5 people in your study have physiological discomfort?
Yeah. 1 out of 5 people that responded to this part of the survey, yes.
Do both of those add up to 100%?
Yes, each pie chart adds up to 100%.
So that group is only the negative.
Each person responded with both the benefits, and each person responded to both benefits and drawbacks. Yeah. So yeah, physiological discomfort is for sure a thing, and that needs to be explored more. And finally, other. Other is kind of, we didn't know how to put that in one bin. It's stuff ranging from people reporting pupil dilation, and they don't like that. People reporting that the length of the microdose was too long, but it's supposed to be subperceptual. So if you're noticing it, it wasn't a microdose. People reporting that they didn't get the benefits that they thought they would get. So I didn't really know how to make sense of that.
I'm sorry to bother you.
Yeah.
People could have improved energy and also have physiological discomfort.
Right. Yeah. These are not mutually exclusive. Sorry, can we actually leave questions for the end?
Yeah.
Another thing that I want to talk about in the context of these charts is notice that some of the benefits also appear in the drawbacks. So like you have increased anxiety as a drawback, but there's also reduced anxiety here. And there's improved energy up there, and there's impaired energy here. So that's kind of weird. These are conflicting findings. And it's hard to make sense of it. My go-to is that it's one of two things. Either there are individual differences in how people respond to microdoses, or this is all placebo. I'm not partial. This is stuff that we need to test in a lab setting. After we did all of this, we also asked people specific questions because we didn't really know what they would report here. So we asked people if there are specific changes in behavior. We asked about a few specific things. And this is what we found. This is a little bit of a complex graph. If the triangle is pointing up, it's an increase. If the triangle is pointing down, it's a decrease. Over there, you have the percentage of the people that said that reported that increase or decrease. And at the bottom, you have the specific behavior. So you can see that people reported broadly less substance use, so less alcohol, less caffeine, less cannabis, less illicit drugs. And they responded that they get better sleep, really highly better mood. Like this is a major increase. That's about 60%, 60-something percent. Better meditation, they exercise, they eat better. But they also have more anxiety. That's about, I would say, 40-something percent of the people said that they have more anxiety. This is food for thought. This is for future research to look into. I can't speak to this any more than this is what we found because this is a correlational study. But this is definitely something that's interesting, and I hope to study in the future. So next up, after our qualitative findings, we also had qualitative hypotheses. Now, all the hypotheses that I'm going to present in a minute were all pre-registered. So using that open science framework that I mentioned before, we uploaded all of those ahead of time. We said, this is what we're going to study, and this is what we expect to find. And you can see all of those online. So I'll go over them one by one. First, we hypothesized that microdosers will be lower on negative emotionality. Negative emotionality is a relatively stable personality trait. It's not supposed to change very much during the lifetime. And it involves stuff like poor self-concept, severe mood swings, experiencing a lot of negative affect. And we hypothesized just from anecdotal reports, we thought that microdosers will be lower on this, so generally happier. And this is what we found. I don't know if this looks too good. Nah, you can barely see. That's too bad. On the left, you have microdosers. On the right, you have non-microdosers. This is the way the other charts are going to look like too. And there's a difference. It's a significant difference. It's not huge, but microdosers were for sure lower on negative emotionality. So that hypothesis turned out to be true. Next up, we looked at dysfunctional attitudes. And we thought that microdosers will be lower on this as well because we expected microdosers to be happier and more well-adjusted. The dysfunctional attitude scale measures maladaptive ways of looking at one's life and one's performance. And people who are high on dysfunctional attitudes generally tend to be depressed and anxious. So one example of an item from this scale is, if I fail partially, it's as bad as failing completely. If you believe that, then, well, you shouldn't because a partial failure isn't that bad. But also, if you believe that, it may cause you to feel negative emotions. And here's what we found that you can't really see, but microdosers are lower on dysfunctional attitudes as well. That's also really encouraging. That's great. Next up, we looked at wisdom. We thought that microdosers will be higher on wisdom. And sorry, are you going to stay for the end? Are you going to stay for the end? Can we leave questions for the end? Okay. Yeah, thanks. Wisdom is really tough to conceptualize and let alone measure because you only know if something was wise after the fact, right? You can't really tell if something is wise before it turns out to have been a wise decision. That being said, the scale we use to measure wisdom it puts together a bunch of broadly accepted, I would say, facets of wisdom. Stuff like interest in philosophy, or having a good sense of humor about oneself, or feeling unity with nature, or learning from experience. And so we hypothesize that microdosers will be higher on wisdom because, yeah, we thought that when you microdose, it kind of opens you up to be able to do all these wonderful things for yourself. And what we found, again, is that microdosers were higher on wisdom than non-microdosers. At this point, we were getting pretty surprised because this never happens, that you keep like finding the things that you hypothesize. Normally what happens is that you hypothesize a bunch of things and some of them are true and some of them are not, and that teaches you something. And so at this point, we were starting to get suspicious. We also expected microdosers to be higher on open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is, again, considered a relatively stable personality trait. And so people who are low on open-mindedness are kind of conservative. They stick to the beaten path. They don't seek out novelty. And just, by intuition, we thought, yeah, microdosers are probably going to be higher on this. But also, there's a study from 2011 by McLean et al. That showed that following one full dose of psilocybin, people experienced a significant increase in open-mindedness. So there's also this is the only case where it wasn't just anecdote, but actually published research that supported our hypothesis. And lo and behold, microdosers were higher on open-mindedness too. Now in this case, again, I don't know if you can really see it, but both samples are really close to the top, to 100. And that is probably related to how these are the people that go on social media and want to talk about their microdosing experiences. So they're probably just really open-minded. We thought there would be a ceiling effect here, but even with a ceiling effect, microdosers were still significantly more open-minded than non-microdosers. Finally, creativity. Oh, got the spoiler there. This was the thing that I was most interested in. I was thinking that microdosing enhances creativity. And so there are a lot of different kinds of creativity. I think creativity is probably as difficult to define and measure as wisdom is. I personally don't believe that there's one unitary concept of creativity. There are a bunch of different things that we put in the same bin. And the way we measured creativity, we were looking into divergent creativity. So as many creative ideas for a given object. And that's called the task we use is called the unusual uses task, where people we named a household object, and we said, you have a minute to think of as many creative uses as you can, go. And we used 2 objects. And then we rated that on 3 creativity dimensions. Uncommon, which is just how strange and weird it is. Remote, which is how different this use is from the standard or expected use of this item. And finally, clever, which is how useful or funny this use is. And what you see on the graph is just a pool of all 3 dimensions together. And yeah, microdosers were higher on creativity as well. I do want to say that when we looked at each of the 3 dimensions of creativity, microdosers were higher on each of those individually, and not just when they were all pooled together. So to go over just these findings again, to summarize them, microdosers were higher on negative emotionality, lower on negative emotionality, lower on dysfunctional attitudes, higher on wisdom, higher on open-mindedness, and higher on creativity. So it looks like all of our hypotheses were on point. Because we were suspicious, we reran everything. We found some mistakes, and then we reran everything again, and this all stayed. So we're pretty confident. However, that being said, these are all correlational findings. And so in terms of future directions, there's so much work to be done. This is a very basic scaffolding on which we hope a lot of people do a lot of work in the future. So I think that the first thing that we need to do is we need to replicate these findings or attempt to replicate these findings in a lab setting. We don't know if microdosing causes any of what we saw. And even if it does, we don't know if it does that only for some people. Maybe there are individual differences that we need to be looking at. That's extremely important. There are also, and once we've found that, the next step would probably be to use some kind of neuroimaging, like EEG or fMRI, to see which areas of the brain are reacting to microdosing and how. And whether that happens longitudinally, so over time, or is it something acute? There's a lot of work like that to be done. Other things that we would probably want to do is try and use microdosing in the context, for example, of psychotherapy, because it could really open people up. It could help them achieve better results out of psychotherapy. Perhaps not in the same way and not to the same magnitude that research on MDMA has shown it to be useful, but maybe in different ways. So I think that could be really interesting. And we would also need to make sure that it's safe, you know? So we would need to have people microdose and then go into a driving simulator and see if they drive any worse, stuff like that, right? And like that's just one example, but we need to make sure that it's safe, that people can microdose and then go about their day, kind of like what I said before. It needs to be sub-perceptual and it needs to not affect day-to-day function. Yeah, so bottom line, what I'm trying to say, these results are really promising, but there's a lot more work to do. And I would take them with a grain of salt because they're all correlational. So to summarize what we found that in terms of the qualitative results, main benefits reported are improved mood, focus, and creativity. And the main drawbacks reported are illegality, physiological discomfort, and other non-specific complaints. We also have these findings about how microdosing enhances and harms anxiety, focus, and mood. In terms of the quantitative findings, microdosers scored lower on negative emotionality and lower on dysfunctional attitudes, higher on open-mindedness, wisdom, and creativity. I want to take a quick moment to thank everyone that was involved in this research. A lot of cool people, and I also want to say thanks to the creativity judges that went through a lot of responses, and that was a lot of hard work. And also my colleague Thomas Anderson is going to be speaking at the biohacking conference in October. So if people are interested in that, he's going to present much more and more in depth. So feel free to go into that link and yeah, check it out. You can find our study online at this URL. Please email me if you want to say things or ask things. That's it. Questions? Yeah.
So your hunch, based on all the research you've done, on neurogenesis and microdosing, and if you think there's long-term neurogenesis because of microdosing, what kinds of substances do you think would have the most impact in that area?
I have no idea. Sorry. This isn't my field.
So neurogenesis is like growth, new neurons.
Yeah, I know about neurogenesis, but I don't know if I even know as much as you. Like I've heard about it. Yeah. I've read a couple of papers. I know that there's interest in the confluence of psychedelics and neurogenesis, but I don't know that research well enough, and I definitely don't know these substances well enough to speak to that. Sorry. Yeah.
Have you found any interaction by the type of substance that they use to microdose?
No. We looked for that. We thought there may be a difference. We didn't find anything for our pre-registered hypotheses or for the benefits and drawbacks. It was basically the same, which was surprising to me. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that the increase in anxiety is just tied to the fact that it's illegal in the first place?
I think that
So
makes sense.
It's increasing mood and all of these other things positively, but then you get that increase in anxiety because you're walking around with an illicit drug in your system, right?
I think that makes sense for sure. That's one thought that we had. Another thought that we had is that, at least for LSD, it has some stimulating properties. And maybe people are, interpreting this increased like blood flow or whatever as anxiety. So I think that's a good point. Yeah.
A question on the dosing, what was the frequency? If someone is classified as microdosing, how often and for how long do they take the substance?
So these were all self-reported microdosers. The first question was, out of those 4 categories being either I've never done it and not interested and have never done it, and then have done it in the past or am currently doing it. And then if they chose one of the categories that they either have done it in the past or are currently doing it, the next question was, how often did you do it or are you doing it? And then some people reported that they had only microdosed a couple of times. And some people had said that they had been doing it for years.
I mean, when they do it for years, do they do it every day or every third day? Or?
We asked them on average. So on average, like that one slide showed, on average, there was just those 2 bumps of people either doing it. Wow, that was way back. People were doing it either 1 day on, 2 days off, so every third day, or weekly. Those were the 2 most popular spacings.
I have about 400 people that work for me. That's why I'm real curious about this, because most of them, or not half of them, microdose with Red Bull. And I can't see drinking caffeine is any different in fact than this, because people would have the same reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I drink my cup of coffee, I have to have it every morning and all that. So it seems to me that there's a real correlation between the 2. Anything that you're taking in to moderate or modify your personal behavior. So that's what I'm trying to compare this to, and it seems like from all my experience and what you're showing is that it's a fairly valid thing to do if you're writing, creating, doing mathematics. I can't see a downside to it any more than you would for coffee. Something more accepted.
I concur, and I think this is a part of my concern. This is kind of a broader critique of how I worry about microdosing being co-opted and becoming, some new productivity drug.
Yeah.
But I think this is outside of the scope of this talk. If you want, we can chat more later.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I'm wondering about the difference of microdosing on LSD and microdosing on biological mushrooms.
Right. So I think someone here asked that. There was no. I'll start repeating the questions. We found no significant difference for substances. No, between the qualitative findings and the quantitative findings, it was basically all the same. Yeah.
Were there any differences with frequency of use? For example, the first mode of every 3 days in the weekly mode?
No, none for that either. And that was surprising to us because there's a lot of research. So I think it is my understanding that Jim Fadiman and Sophia Korb suggested that people do it using this schedule because there's all this research that shows desensitization of neurotransmitters, the relevant neurotransmitters, after 2 or 3 days, for 2 or 3 days. And so we expected to see the larger benefits for people who do it frequently rather than non-frequently, but we found the same. So that's a surprising finding for sure. Yeah.
I just had a question about when you were talking about the conflicting findings between, for instance, reduced anxiety and anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort of inferred that maybe it's due to placebo.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on potentially during the setting. Like I can imagine if somebody is going into sort of a creative or more laid-back job, they might experience reduced anxiety versus if somebody's going to a high-level business meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they're under totally different setting. So I was wondering if that is something you might be interested in.
I think that's a great point. So I'm just going to repeat that. This gentleman suggested that the difference, the reason we found both increased anxiety and reduced anxiety is that maybe the difference in context. And I think that's a great point. That's for sure a thing that we should be looking at in the future. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of the long-term sustained effect on these neurotransmitters? Or is it after 4 days you're back to normal and got the same trip you had in the first part of the week?
Yeah, so I think, so it's kind of like there are 2 questions there. Research has shown that, yeah, if you space it enough, yeah, you can experience a similar trip. But in terms of the long-term effects, we don't know yet. There are some concerns of cardiotoxicity for psilocybin That has been a matter of contention. But yeah, we don't know it yet exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Just, sure.
You were talking about future directions, maybe doing some clinical trials. Are you planning on doing something like that? Is something in the works?
Yeah, for sure. We need a lot of help. So if people are interested, please come see me. We can chat.
For your creativity experiments, which category of items have you received most of?
So do you mean in the responses?
Yeah, in the responses.
I don't want to tell you what the objects we used were because that may spoil it for future research. We saw a lot of people that to me it was very clear that they were responding while sitting at home next to their computer. And so they said a bunch of things that were like either about like their window or their computer monitor, stuff like that.
Category meant like if you get the most more unusual items, if you get more remote items, if you get the most.
Sorry, can you say that again?
If you get the most. You get more unusual items or more remote items, more uncommon items. Categorize them into.
Yeah. So the way. I guess I didn't explain how this task works. So I'm gonna, like, if we were to do this right now, I would name a household object, and you would think of as many creative uses without categories. Just think of as many creative uses, and then I rate with all of your responses 3 times. Once for uncommon, once for remote, and once for clever. I am going to assume that we're out of time. All right, thanks everybody.